Trump just delivered what everyone assumed would be a standard campaign speech in South Carolina, but something went terribly wrong. Within 72 hours, three Republican governors publicly distanced themselves from statements he made that night. Two major donors suspended contributions pending clarification, and a leaked internal memo from the Republican National Committee reveals emergency strategy sessions to contain what senior officials are calling a catastrophic messaging failure. When your own party starts damage control before the opposition even responds, you know something unprecedented just happened. Hit that subscribe button right now because you will not want to miss any of the videos I release. So what exactly did Trump say that triggered this level of panic? According to the full transcript released by local news networks on January 14th, Trump spent 23 minutes discussing what he called necessary corrections to constitutional interpretation. But buried in that speech were specific claims about presidential authority that legal scholars immediately flagged as fundamentally incompatible with constitutional limits. This was not a policy disagreement or typical campaign hyperbole. Multiple constitutional law professors who reviewed the transcript independently reached the same conclusion. The statements reflect either a complete misunderstanding of executive power or a deliberate attempt to normalize authority that does not exist under our system of government. Here is the full picture of what has been unfolding. Trump has always pushed boundaries on executive authority. We have seen clashes with courts, conflicts with Congress, and repeated assertions of presidential power that make legal experts nervous. But this speech crossed into entirely new territory. According to reporters who attended the January 13th rally in Charleston, Trump appeared confident and energized as he outlined what a second term would look like. The crowd was receptive, cheering at familiar lines about draining the swamp and fighting the deep state. Then, approximately 40 minutes into the speech, Trump pivoted to what he described as fixing the problems with how our government operates. That is when things took a sharp turn. Smash that like button if this is making sense so far. Here is where it really gets serious. According to the transcript verified by three separate news organizations, Trump stated that a president who believes the Justice Department is being used against him has the constitutional authority to personally direct prosecutions and personally dismiss cases without going through normal channels. He specifically said that executive privilege means the president can classify or declassify any investigation at will, including those involving himself or his associates, because the executive branch ultimately answers to one person. Legal experts who reviewed these statements were stunned. A former federal prosecutor with 22 years of experience told CNN that this reflects a complete inversion of how our justice system operates. The president does not have personal authority over individual prosecutions. That is precisely what the independence of the Justice Department is designed to prevent. Here is what multiple sources say happened next. On January 14th, three prominent constitutional law professors published a joint statement calling Trump's claims legally inaccurate and dangerous to democratic norms. The statement, signed by scholars from Yale, Stanford, and the University of Chicago, explained that the independence of federal law enforcement from direct presidential control is a cornerstone of American governance. While the president appoints the attorney general and has broad executive authority, that authority does not extend to personally directing or dismissing specific criminal investigations. That would effectively place the president above the law, a concept fundamentally rejected by our constitutional system. By January 15th, the political fallout began in earnest. Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia, a Republican who has maintained a complicated relationship with Trump, issued a carefully worded statement emphasizing that all Americans, including presidents, are subject to the rule of law and that no elected official should claim authority to interfere with ongoing criminal investigations. Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, another Republican, went further, stating on Twitter that the remarks in South Carolina were deeply concerning and inconsistent with constitutional governance. Drop a comment right now if you saw this coming. I read every single one. Now things get absolutely wild. The leaked RNC memo obtained by Politico on January 16th reveals that senior party officials held 3 emergency conference calls between January 14th and January 16th to discuss response strategy. The memo describes internal disagreement about whether to defend the statements, ignore them entirely, or attempt damage control by clarifying that Trump was speaking about hypothetical reforms rather than asserting existing authority. One section of the memo notes that multiple Republican senators privately expressed concern that the remarks could become campaign ammunition, particularly among independent voters who prioritize institutional stability. Another section acknowledges that attempts to walk back the statements risk alienating the base, which views strong assertions of presidential power as a sign of strength rather than constitutional overreach. The bombshell moment came when two major Republican donors, whose identities were confirmed through campaign finance disclosures, suspended planned contributions totaling approximately $4.8 million until Trump's team provides clarification on the constitutional claims made in South Carolina. One donor, a prominent business executive who has supported Republican candidates for 3 decades, told the Wall Street Journal that he cannot, in good conscience, fund a campaign that promotes fundamental misunderstandings about the limits of executive power. This move sent shockwaves through Republican fundraising circles. When longtime major donors publicly paused support over constitutional concerns rather than policy disagreements, it signals something far more serious than typical campaign turbulence. The message is clear. There is a line even for loyal supporters, and claiming personal authority over criminal prosecutions crosses it. This is not the first time a president or presidential candidate has tested the boundaries of executive authority. Think back to Richard Nixon's infamous claim that when the president does it, that means it is not illegal. That assertion, made during the Frost interviews after his resignation, became a defining example of the dangers of unchecked executive power. Nixon's presidency ended precisely because he treated the Justice Department as a personal tool, firing the special prosecutor investigating Watergate in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. The constitutional crisis that followed proved that presidential authority has limits, even in matters of national security and executive privilege. Then there was George W. Bush's expansion of executive power after September 11th, including assertions about warrantless surveillance and detention authority. While those claims were controversial and led to significant legal battles, they were at least framed as interpretations of existing statutory and constitutional authority during wartime, not personal power to direct individual prosecutions for political purposes. Subscribe immediately if you have not yet. This content does not exist anywhere else. And let us not forget Barack Obama's use of executive orders to advance policy goals when Congress would not act on immigration reform. Republicans criticized those actions as executive overreach, arguing that presidents cannot simply bypass Congress when they disagree with legislative inaction. Yet even Obama's most aggressive executive actions were defended as falling within established precedent and statutory authority, not as claims of personal power over the justice system itself. Now, however, it is different. Trump's statements in South Carolina were not about interpreting existing law or using executive orders to implement policy. They were explicit claims that a president can personally control prosecutions and investigations, including those involving himself. That represents a qualitatively different assertion of power, one that legal scholars say has no basis in constitutional text, structure, or precedent. The pattern is clear. When candidates or presidents claim authority that fundamentally undermines institutional independence, even their own party eventually recognizes the danger. Political expediency alone cannot justify abandoning foundational principles of democratic governance. So what allegedly triggered this unprecedented reaction? According to legal and political experts who reviewed the full speech transcript, Trump's statements directly contradict established Supreme Court precedent on executive power and prosecutorial independence. The Supreme Court held in Morrison v. Olson that certain protections for prosecutorial independence are constitutional precisely to prevent presidents from using law enforcement as a political weapon. More recently, in Trump v. Vance, the court rejected claims of absolute presidential immunity from criminal investigation, affirming that presidents are not above the law. Here's the kicker. Trump's speech did not acknowledge these legal realities or argue for changing them through proper constitutional processes. Instead, he simply asserted that presidential authority already includes powers that courts have explicitly said do not exist. This was not a policy proposal or a campaign promise to reform the system. It was a claim of existing authority that contradicts binding legal precedent. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. And here is what should alarm everyone. This is not just about one speech or one isolated statement. If a presidential candidate can claim personal authority over criminal investigations and prosecutions without facing significant pushback from their own party, the principle of equal justice under law becomes meaningless. Once that precedent is normalized, there is no turning back. The idea that presidents are subject to the same laws as everyone else, a concept as old as the republic itself, simply dissolves. This puts Republicans in an extraordinarily difficult position. On one side, they face pressure from a base that remains fiercely loyal and interprets any criticism of Trump as betrayal. That means defending every statement regardless of constitutional implications, attacking legal experts as partisan hacks, and framing legitimate concerns as deep state resistance. On the other side, they must reckon with constitutional principles that define American democracy, principles that many of them spent their entire careers claiming to defend. They now have to explain to voters why a president should have personal control over prosecutions, a position that contradicts everything they have said about limited government and the rule of law. And here is the tricky part. There is no credible constitutional defense. Either Trump's claims are accurate, in which case centuries of constitutional law and Supreme Court precedent are wrong, or they are fundamentally mistaken, which would require acknowledging that the candidate is either ignorant of basic constitutional principles or deliberately misleading voters about presidential authority. Legal and political analysts are calling this a stress test of constitutional commitment in real time. A Harvard law professor who has written extensively on executive power told NBC News that the statements in South Carolina represent the most direct assertion of personal prosecutorial authority by a major presidential candidate in modern American history. While presidents have always had some influence over Justice Department priorities, claiming personal power to direct or dismiss specific investigations crosses a constitutional line that even Nixon never explicitly claimed in public before his downfall. A former Republican White House counsel added that these claims should concern everyone regardless of party affiliation. The independence of federal law enforcement is not a partisan issue. It is a structural protection that prevents any president from weaponizing the justice system against political opponents or shielding allies from accountability. Do me a favor and slam that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more people. Even conservative legal scholars who generally favor strong executive power have expressed serious reservations. A fellow at the Federalist Society, an organization known for conservative judicial philosophy, wrote in the National Review that while presidents have broad constitutional authority, that authority is not unlimited and certainly does not include personal control over individual prosecutions. The piece emphasized that conservatives who claim to value limited government and constitutional constraints cannot simultaneously defend unlimited presidential power over law enforcement. The intellectual inconsistency is simply too stark. So let us break down what this could mean. First, the political impact is immediate and measurable. 3 Republican governors have publicly distanced themselves from Trump's constitutional claims. 2 major donors have suspended contributions totaling nearly $5 million pending clarification. The RNC is conducting emergency damage control sessions. While none of this guarantees electoral consequences, it demonstrates that Trump's own party recognizes serious vulnerabilities in his constitutional messaging. Before this speech, most Republicans assumed they could defend Trump's statements as tough talk or political posturing. Now, respected party figures are signaling that some claims cross a line that cannot be defended without abandoning core constitutional principles. Second, it creates massive problems for Republican messaging on law and order. For decades, Republicans have campaigned on respect for law enforcement, constitutional limits on government power, and the principle that no one is above the law. Trump's assertion that presidents can personally control prosecutions directly contradicts all of those messages. Every Republican candidate will now face questions about whether they agree that presidents should have personal authority over criminal investigations. Campaign strategists are already predicting attack ads featuring Republican officials struggling to reconcile their traditional law and order messaging with defense of Trump's constitutional claims. Finally, looking ahead, The broader political implications are profound. This fundamentally changes the stakes of presidential elections. If voters accept the premise that presidents can personally direct or dismiss prosecutions, elections become referendums on who should control law enforcement rather than who has the best policies or leadership qualities. That transforms the presidency from the chief executive of a constitutional system into something far closer to personal rule. Every election becomes an existential battle over who controls the justice system rather than a peaceful transfer of power within established constitutional constraints. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I am genuinely curious to see your perspective. But beyond the immediate political fallout, this is really about fundamental constitutional architecture. The framers designed our system specifically to prevent concentration of power in any single individual or branch. They understood that human nature creates strong incentives to abuse power, which is why they built in structural protections like separation of powers, checks and balances, and independent institutions. The independence of federal law enforcement from direct presidential control is one of those structural protections. It ensures that justice is administered based on facts and law rather than political convenience or personal loyalty. If a president can delay investigations, dismiss prosecutions, or direct law enforcement to target political opponents, that protection disappears entirely. Civilian control of law enforcement becomes personal control, and the distinction between lawful authority and authoritarian power collapses. The implications for American democracy would be catastrophic. This scenario is causing genuine alarm among constitutional scholars across the political spectrum. Reports indicate that multiple legal organizations are preparing amicus briefs and position papers addressing the constitutional claims made in Trump's speech. Some are considering whether formal ethics complaints or bar disciplinary actions are appropriate for attorneys who publicly endorse views that contradict established constitutional law. The legal community is mobilizing because it recognizes that normalizing these claims threatens the entire framework of constitutional governance. Meanwhile, Trump's core supporters are absolutely dismissing the concerns as hysteria from the establishment. Social media is flooded with arguments that strong presidents need strong authority and that legal technicalities should not prevent effective governance. To the base, this is not a constitutional crisis. It is proof that Trump is willing to fight the system rather than be constrained by it, which is precisely what they elected him to do. Things escalated further when Trump himself responded to the criticism with posts on Truth Social. He called the constitutional concerns fake news and claimed that legal experts criticizing his statements are partisan Democrats trying to tie his hands before he even takes office. He specifically attacked Governor Kemp as a disloyal rhino who should face a primary challenge and dismissed the donor concerns as establishment types who never really supported the America First agenda anyway. Stay with me. What comes next will completely change how you view the situation. Here is what makes the reaction even more significant. Trump's response did not address the constitutional substance at all. Instead of citing legal authority or explaining how his claims align with established precedent, the reaction was pure deflection and personal attacks on critics. When your defense strategy is attacking those raising constitutional concerns rather than providing constitutional justification, you have essentially conceded that no credible justification exists. Legal experts immediately noted the problem. Presidential power is not defined by assertion or personal confidence. It is defined by constitutional text, historical practice, and judicial interpretation. Claiming that critics are partisan does not make unconstitutional authority constitutional. It just confirms that the candidate cannot defend the claims on the merits. This goes far beyond typical campaign rhetoric or political exaggeration. It is about whether presidential candidates can claim powers that do not exist and face no meaningful accountability from their own party. If there are no consequences for asserting personal authority over prosecutions in direct contradiction of Supreme Court precedent, it signals that constitutional limits are purely optional when politically inconvenient. It is not just about one candidate or one election. It is about whether the American constitutional system has the resilience to reject claims of power that fundamentally undermine its structure. If this blows your mind, hit that like button right now. Here is where we stand. A major presidential candidate just claimed personal authority over criminal prosecutions in direct contradiction of established constitutional law. 3 Republican governors publicly distanced themselves from those claims. 2 major donors suspended nearly $5 million in contributions. The RNC is conducting emergency damage control, and constitutional scholars across the political spectrum are sounding alarms about the implications. This is no longer just partisan politics. It is about whether we accept presidential candidates claiming powers that courts have explicitly said do not exist. When Republican governors and major donors openly break with their own party's candidate over constitutional principles, we have entered genuinely unprecedented territory. If there are no consequences, it sets a dangerous precedent that presidential authority is whatever a president says it is, regardless of constitutional text or judicial interpretation. Keep a close eye on this story. More Republican officials are reportedly considering whether to publicly address the constitutional concerns raised by Trump's speech. Legal organizations are preparing formal responses analyzing the claims against established precedent, and voters across the political spectrum are watching closely to see whether constitutional principles still matter when they conflict with political loyalty. Before we wrap up, smash that subscribe button so you never miss content like this. Here is where things stand right now. A presidential candidate just asserted authority that constitutional scholars say does not exist. His own party is fracturing over whether to defend the indefensible or acknowledge that some claims cross constitutional lines. Donors are demanding clarification before contributing millions more to the campaign. This is not just another controversy that will fade with the next news cycle. This is a fundamental test of whether constitutional limits on presidential power still constrain political ambition or whether they have become suggestions that candidates can ignore when convenient. The claims are public. The criticism is bipartisan. Now we wait to see if constitutional principles still hold any weight when they conflict with political expediency. The stakes have never been higher, the constitutional line has never been clearer, and the crisis of accountability has never been more immediate. Pause for a second and hit that like button if you are finding value in this coverage.